Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer DeVere Brody. I'm the faculty director of the Center for the Study of Comparative Race and Ethnicity here at Stanford University, but I'm joining you from the unceded Muwekma Ohlone homelands in Oakland, California. Today's event is part of our series on race, technology, and civil society. In the series, which is the inaugural one today, we bring together scholars and practitioners across fields and different sectors to examine the ways that new technologies impact racial equity and racial justice. Our next event in this series, so please continue to join us, will be on November 12th, and we'll focus on financial technologies or fintech, including the ways that new technologies impact the generation of wealth and access to credit, especially for people of color. Future events during the year will examine a range of issues, including bias in data sets and models, affect recognition, and policy making, as well as policing and other events. We really want to thank our partners in this series. We start with the Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab, the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, Digital Impact, the Public Interest Technology University Network, and the Program in African and African American Studies here at Stanford. I want to begin with our moderator for the panel, and just also to thank the wonderful staff at the center who've done so much to host this event, including our executive director, Daniel Murray. We were originally going to have our colleague, Professor Michelle Elam here. She had a family emergency, and we are, of course, thrilled that our other colleague and friend, Professor Duana Fullwiley, will be here to moderate the panel. So I'm going to introduce her, and then she will introduce our distinguished speakers. Duana Fullwiley is a literary medical anthropologist and ethnographer of science who teaches in the Department of Anthropology. She's also a race and tech affiliate at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. She writes broadly about ethics, genomics, and global health to better understand how humans imagine and seed ideas of biological difference. She's authored an award-winning anthropological books and works focused on the actors within science who have written the normative languages in their fields in terms of race, nation, territory, and the ever-shifting concepts of inclusion and citizenship. Interdisciplinarity and multilingual with projects that span global metropolises in the West Africa, France, and the US, Fullwiley's scholarship engages larger questions of ethics and power with an increasing interest in algorithmic and automated systems to track health, migration, and identity. So this is why she's going to be our perfect moderator for today. She also serves as Stanford's newly formed Ethics Review Board and is on the Scientific Advisory Board for the Simons Institute's Theory of Computing for Fairness and collaborates with colleagues there at the Institute at UC Berkeley. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Duana and thank everyone for being here and making time. Good morning.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone at the center who has done such great work putting this whole series together. I'm really looking forward to all the conversations, and I want to also reemphasize that this is the inaugural conversation for the year, focusing on race, tech, and civil society. And so what I'll do is just provide a few opening remarks about this particular session, and then I will introduce you to our esteemed panelists who will take us through these discussions. And so today we are going to be exploring how racial bias is coded into technological systems, whether or not and how technology can advance racial justice and equity, and how scholars and advocates at the intersection of studies in race and technology can actually collaborate and do productive work together. And so from where I sit, there are different registers to think about bias. I'm a cultural anthropologist, with a focus on medicine and science. And so questions of bias and fairness in computing really have to take into consideration, obviously, sort of social histories and cultural politics and what existed before in the social, before tech arrived on the scene, for lack of a better phrase. And so the ways that these tools are being developed in our everyday lives under the rubric of artificial intelligence, obviously, as we know, are increasingly pervasive. So we see it in aspects of law, medicine, therapy, housing, policing, management, transportation, insurance, border control, military strikes, and now even, on a different register, more, sort of humanistic, even painting and the writing of novels have been carried out with AI. So the interdisciplinary conversation that we will have today about the intersection of race and tech invites us to think deeply about fairness in the very build out of the technologies. And this starts with asking hard questions of our social systems that existed long before most tech, as I mentioned before. Therefore, grappling with fairness requires not just plugging away to develop the most tech because we can, but to also cultivate a keen sense of awareness within fairness about why we are developing certain tools at all. Our panelists today will help us think through the importance of always attending to the social and political histories that precede current AI applications. And of utmost importance, they will help us see how it is key to rehumanize what often gets abstracted as data. This means to probe the way that data generated by people is constructed or framed and then used and marketed. It requires that we see beyond data points fed into algorithms to remember that there are lives, actions, thoughts, desires, etc., that these data represent. The data itself, classified as such, are expressions of our social values, what we value and who we value. I'm extremely excited to explore these topics with our esteemed panelists today. So to the bios. I'll just go in alphabetical order. They are A, B, and C. Makes it a little easy. Our first panelist is Rediet Abebe. She's a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and is an incoming assistant professor of computer science at the University of California, Berkeley. She completed her PhD in computer science at Cornell University. Rediet's research broadly falls in the fields of algorithms and AI with a focus on equity and justice concerns. Specifically, she designs and analyzes algorithmic optimization and network-based techniques to improve access to opportunity for historically underserved and disadvantaged communities. She also works on human-centered approaches to mechanism design and co-founded and co-organizes Mechanism Design for Social Good, an interdisciplinary, multi-institutional research initiative. She is also an advocate for representation, equity, and inclusion in computing, and is the co-founder of Black in AI. And both of those, I believe, she founded when she was a graduate student doing her PhD. All the more impressive. Rediet has been honored with the 2020 Innovation for Equity Rising Star Award. She has been highlighted as an MIT Review 35 under 35 on that list in 2016, and was among the Bloomberg 50 One to Watch roster in 2019. Welcome, Rediet. Next is Ruha Benjamin. Ruha is an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she studies the social dimensions of science, technology, and medicine. She is also the founder of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab and the author of 2 books, People Science and Race After Technology, and she also edited the book Captivating Technology. Ruha writes, teaches, and speaks widely about the relationship between knowledge and power, race and citizenship, health and justice. She has been awarded fellowships and grants from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and the Institute for Advanced Study. This year, she is one of the first in a cohort of Freedom Scholars, an initiative supporting progressive academics who are at the forefront of movements for economic and social justice. Welcome, Ruha. And finally, our third panelist is Matt Cagle. Matt is a technology and civil liberties attorney at the ACLU of Northern California, where he works on digital issues, including privacy, surveillance, and free speech. Matt focuses on ensuring modern digital systems, whether we are talking about private or public platforms, are publicly debated and implemented with equity and justice in mind. In his role at the ACLU, Matt works with communities and policymakers to end discriminatory and selective police surveillance. Matt has helped lead efforts to pass surveillance legislation across the Bay Area. Notably, he served on the groundbreaking Oakland committee that restricted vast surveillance complexes and created the first of its kind Privacy Advocacy Commission. Prior to joining the ACLU full-time, Matt worked in private practice, advising startups on privacy issues. He attended law school here at Stanford Law, where he was a member editor of the Stanford Journal of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. So thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. And I look forward to a very lively discussion. And so, to get it started, I have a few questions that we at the center came up with, and just sort of thinking about conversations that come up with our students that have come up in teaching and in larger conversations around AI at Stanford. As you are aware, there are several initiatives, especially the human-centered artificial intelligence initiative. And so I wonder, to begin, if each of you can tell us a bit about your respective work that engages the relationships between these new technologies and racial equity and justice. And I'm especially interested in the fact that some of these efforts are at the individual level, some at the regulatory level, the government level, cultural exchange, and mindset change level. And if you could just talk about, specifics and what your larger visions are with regard to the projects that you're doing. So I'll start with Ruha.
All right, it's so good to be in conversation with everyone. Thanks everyone for tuning in on this, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening where you are. I want to start with my ground zero for this, which is really the classroom and teaching. And I think we often jump to thinking about public engagement as out there in the world, when one of the primary publics, as professors, are our students, and engaging their own ideas and thinking across fields. And so, for example, I teach a large intro to race lecture class that draws students from STEM fields, humanities, social sciences. And so for me, one of the drivers behind my work is to give such a diverse disciplinary group a shared language that we can even begin to name and talk about the phenomenon that relate to race, technology, and equity. And so for me, before we can even begin to do these kind of deep dives in terms of research, we need to be able to name phenomenon. So that power of naming and the language and the shared grammar, I think, is really a first step into all these other sort of stages of engagement. And so that's where I started to feel like the language that I had was not quite developed enough to span this really broad kind of disciplinary public, which are my students. And so that motivated me in many ways to write Race After Technology, to edit Captivating Technology, which brings together scholars doing these deep dives, but where we can talk across our fields. And then, for me, the next step is thinking about research, and research not simply as an individual endeavor, a kind of lone wolf practice, but thinking collaboratively and in connection with communities for whom these technologies have such great impact, but where they're often not around the table to do that naming and that defining. And so research in terms of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, employs students to collaborate with communities to name phenomenon, to study phenomenon, to produce data that is really useful for advocacy, for popular education. And so although the lab started about 2 years ago, it really took off this past summer when many of my students they lost their internships and jobs, obviously during the pandemic. And so I wanted to employ them to do something meaningful around the pandemic. So we created a pandemic portal that, 10 teams of students working with communities across the country, organizations, and then producing tangible outputs that can be used well after the research is done. And so I invite people, I see someone posted the link to the data lab in the chat. I invite you to visit it. The work continues. And so that particular endeavor is another way that I'm sort of, channeling both my pedagogy, my advocacy, my intellectual passions to work collaboratively to engage these questions of racism, technology, and the relationship between innovation and inequity. And so I'll stop there. There's more I can say, but that just gives you a sense of my own starting points for this.
Thank you so much, Ruha. Why don't we now go to Rediet?
Hello, you can hear me?
Yes, you're coming through
very
very
good. I just wanted to first start by saying it is such an honor for me to be here. I've been following all of your work throughout my time as a graduate student, and so I was really surprised to be invited, but very happy to be here. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciate you all making time. And in terms of the question that you asked, Duana, I'll share a personal story. So I moved to the US in 2009 to start undergrad. And I was born and raised in Ethiopia. So, everyone around me was Black, right? So I didn't even think of being Black as an identity, right? You just don't think of it. If everyone that you see around you is Black, you're like, well, everyone is Black. You don't have to think about it, right? And I remember when I arrived in the US, my freshman year especially, I was like, something feels off here, right? And I just couldn't put my finger on it. I knew some of like the vague American history. I, didn't learn it when I was in high school. I didn't have to, right? And so it just felt off to me. And I engaged in some sociology classes, in the African and African history department at Harvard. And I was just shocked. Like I was shocked to learn about all these things that we talk about as though they happened such a long time ago, didn't actually happen that long ago. And so it's no surprise that their legacy lives on and is very active and present and actively sort of damaging people's livelihoods. And since then, I've been thinking a lot about representation. And something that feels odd to me is that a lot of times when we think about representation of people in various spaces, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in, companies, departments, whatever it is, we sort of think of it as like an afterthought, right? It's like we're doing whatever it is that we're doing. Oh my gosh, we don't have enough people of this background. We should probably just invite more people here. And to me, I actually think of representation as a form of intervention. It says that if you have these people there and they're empowered to begin with, and they get to shape what you're gonna do and how you're gonna do it from the very beginning, from the get-go, then you probably would have fewer issues to fix, right? Because when things go wrong, they would have probably been called out early. And I think that a lot of times when we think about representation within tech more generally, within computer science, academic computer science, which is my space, I think we like to pretend like things are better than they are, but things are really bad. So for instance, this year I was on the faculty job market. Several of my friends who are also Black women were on the faculty job market in computer science. And we, got these positions that we're all excited about, and we're joining these different institutions. And each of us are the first Black women to have ever been hired by these departments ever. We might even be the first, one of the first to even be interviewed, right? And so we're sort of like going into the space that wasn't created for us, right? And we're hoping and we're trusting that our colleagues are going to trust us when we identify things that aren't working for us, trust us when we identify things that aren't working for students and are actively contributing to the problem, right? And so I think a lot about representation, not just as like a a nice to have or a thing that you should think about at the end, but rather as a form of intervention to fix problems before they actually appear or they get worse.
Thank you so much, Rediet. That's such an important takeaway, representation as intervention. Matt, we are on to you.
Yeah, so thank you again to Stanford and everyone for having me. I feel very lucky to be among such distinguished panelists and to be taking part in this conversation and really to be learning and getting outside of the ACLU bubble to be like learning more about amazing work being done at the intersection of race and technology. So thank you so much for having me today. At the ACLU, we are a very privileged organization, and what that I think really does mean is that we need to be thinking constantly about how we are embedding community members, and we're embedding racial justice values in all of the work we do. One of the things we try to do as a sort of operating mechanism at the ACLU Northern California is to do something called integrated advocacy. We didn't invent this, but it essentially means that we don't only just work in the legislature or the courts, or we don't only bring forward communications and organizing strategies and tactics. What we do is we sit down with our community partners, we sit down with our partners at organizations devoted to racial justice exclusively, and we have conversations about what are the goals going to be on particular projects and how are we going to achieve them. And the question of how we're going to achieve them is actually dictated by those conversations and by what we think as a group and as a team and as a coalition will be the most effective way to achieve racial justice and equity goals in the work that we do. A good example of this is legislation, a campaign that I led an effort on in San Francisco last year. So San Francisco is the first city ever to pass legislation banning the use of facial recognition by governments. We didn't get to that point where that is now the law in San Francisco and I think 14 other US cities simply by following what legislatures were doing, or simply by the ACLU putting out an idea that wasn't informed by conversations with our allies. What we did is we had a series of ongoing conversations with the people, the communities who are impacted by technologies deployed by police, with organizations who have devoted their work to representing and advocating for Black and Brown and immigrant communities. Mm-hmm. And we convened a coalition before legislation was ever introduced that included racial justice advocates, immigrants' rights advocates, people advocating for criminal defendants and the unhoused, the LGBTQ community, which in San Francisco has long been placed under police surveillance, decades and decades of police surveillance. We had conversations with those folks and created a space not where the ACLU came into the room and said, this is the solution that we're all going to run with here, but we said, what if we did X, Y, and Z? What if we banned facial recognition in San Francisco? What do you think about that? Why do you think we should do it? How do you think we should talk about it? And from there, we crafted together a communication strategy, an organizing strategy that centered the impacts and the community members who would be affected by this kind of ordinance, and ultimately a legal strategy that was informed by that as well. We knew together where our red lines would be on the legislation and where we would not ever negotiate, because we had had community conversations and conversations with our allies about where the law should be and how that law should reflect the desire of the community and the people who are actually impacted by the execution and the enforcement of the law. And I think this really came really full circle yesterday. Actually 2 days ago, the ACLU and our partners at Electronic Frontier Foundation brought a lawsuit actually to enforce a separate part of this law that requires oversight of surveillance technology. We learned, our friends at Electronic Frontier Foundation learned this summer that during the protests following the murder of George Floyd, that SFPD used a private camera network with over 400 cameras to spy on the demonstrations and to watch the demonstrations as they marched down Market Street, around Union Square in downtown San Francisco or near downtown San Francisco. And this is a violation of that law that the ACLU and our partners worked to pass. And so we brought forward a lawsuit on behalf of Black and Latinx plaintiffs who were affected by the surveillance, who feel like they are going to have more trouble organizing and protesting and recruiting activists because of the surveillance. And now it's time for the SFPD to answer for itself. And so it's been a really, I think it's been a really great process to be part of, to write a law in conjunction with our partners, and then see it enforced on behalf of our partners and on behalf of people who are actually impacted by the law. So that's sort of big picture, the method we try to use to do this work. And it's not perfect. It has many shortcomings, I think, but it's grounded in an understanding that the ACLU cannot be just plowing ahead without talking to non-lawyers, talking to people who are impacted, and really talking to Black and Brown communities specifically.
Thank you so much. I was not aware of that latest development, and it's very disturbing, right? So we are obviously living in very tense times, and there's such a sort of clear, older power structure that somehow retains, you know, despite the fact that there's so much progress happening at the same time. I just say this sort of mantra that things are getting better and better and better and worse and worse and worse. And, you know, there's something about what each of you described that expresses that in some way. And I'm so happy to see all of you on the ground and doing this kind of collaborative work and really thinking deeply with people about how we might, you know, shift some of that ground in terms of control, power, and just the ways that people participate and build a different kind of future. And so I just want to, you know, just give you all props for that work, beyond props. And also, you know, just dig a little bit deeper and just sort of have you talk a little bit more about how you're positioned and, you know, how you see yourself and your work, given the very layered and complex, you know, sort of just arrangement of power, for lack of a better word, right? We have two very elderly white male candidates as our prospects for president. We have so much, you know, just brilliance and activism and art and just rethinking the way things should be at various levels of civil society. And you just, how do you see yourselves and the work that you do sort of navigating these different terrains and really trying to make inroads and make change? It's a challenge, and so I'm just wondering how you deal with that challenge, and, you know, sort of what your sort of ground, you know, sort of work is, and how you just stay sane, you know, as well, you know, amidst it all. So
yeah, I love that you used the word power several times, because I think that shift from talking about technology and bias to thinking about what are the power structures and the relations of power. And I think once we do that, the next step is really to have an expansive understanding of how power operates. It's not simply top-down sort of policy change, as important as that is, and the concentration of power, whether in industry or government, but to really understand the diffusion of power, the everyday forms of power. So thinking about locally specific for each of us, what are the relations of power in our own social arena? So let's say for me, academia, right? And so thinking about what is the kind of power that academia exercises in the world, and then let me think about what of that is really entrenching domination and inequality, and how can I, in my little position, try to intervene? And I think each of us needs to both do an exercise where we think individually, how do we do it? But even more importantly, to think about who do we need to link arms with to make that diffusion or that horizontal mode of power more powerful. And so, I mean, one of the examples that come to mind, perhaps not many people know, I think it'll be of interest to you, Duana, is that one of the sort of pillars of predictive policing, the kind of intellectual foundations of predictive policing, comes from academia, comes from anthropology. And so a professor at UCLA, I think his name is Brattenham, was one of the co-founders of Predpol, that then was used by the LAPD in order to surveil and engage in this sort of, you know, newfangled kind of racial control. And so for me, when I hear something like that, and I think about, okay, so if the intellectual foundations, the academic legitimacy of these harmful technologies are coming from an arena in which I am situated, then I feel responsible to provide the intellectual foundation for those who want to question, resist, and push back against it. So the kind of line between I'm just doing my intellectual work and then that's the policy work and the advocacy work over there completely ignores the fact that intellectuals and academics are providing the armament for continued forms of subordination and domination. So, you know, that's one way to think about, like, what is our responsibility? And I think when, no matter the sector that you're in, you have to own your own complicity, the complicity of your profession, your colleagues, your, you know, what you do, and then think about how you're going to challenge that. What new patterns of thought and action are you going to then engender?
Yeah, great.
I wanted to follow up on what Ruha just said, which I completely agree with. One of the things that I think is super interesting in academia, especially in computer science academia, is that so the kind of work that I do, which is I effectively call it computational social work now. I engage a lot with social workers, but I do the computer science side of things, the algorithmic mechanism design, machine learning side of things. And I remember when I was doing my pre-job talk tour, I gave a talk, and it was like a very technical talk. Like, you have to be into optimization to actually appreciate the full scope of what I was talking about. And a professor came up to me at the end and he said, "So, are you an activist or an academic?" This was what he asked me word for word. And I knew this was not a compliment. He was not saying this as a compliment, right? And so I explained to him, I said, well, you know, you have colleagues in your department who use similar techniques as I use, and oftentimes they're applied for, you know, a bunch of things like ad auctions and, you know, this, you can just like name all the common things that they do. And as you can see, and as I can see, this actually strengthens the technical work that we do, right? Because you're kind of like inspired by real world examples of how to sell ads, to optimize for whatever. And I said, you know, effectively what I do is exactly that, except that rather than being inspired by ad auctions, I'm inspired by social work practice, right? But everything else is the same. And so I don't see what I do as being less technical just because it happens to be inspired by something else, right? And it just, I think especially that conversation, but many others that I had, really led me to think critically about what we see as being within scope of academia, right? It's not actually how applied or not applied it is. It's actually what it's applied to. And when it's applied to things that are going to undermine the power structures that exist, when it's going to lead to more equity and justice, then we're a lot more critical about it. Then we say, well, is it technical enough? Did you actually do this? Is this actually an area that's really interesting to computer science? Are you really a computer scientist? I have so many degrees. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do for you to just be like, yes, you have like multiple, you're done here, right?
Legit.
And I just think that this is like, to me, this is so evident, but it's going to be such a long road. And so one of the things that I've tried to do for myself is to just sort of I acknowledged early for myself that I was never going to fit in as the institute exists, as it currently exists. And so if I'm going to stand out anyway, I might as well just do things the way I want to see them. And I knew very well that I might get pushed out. And I sort of came to terms with that very early in grad school. I had a very long conversation with my advisor where we were like, I'm going to do this and I might get no jobs. And he was like, yep, you might. And I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. And he's like, okay, you know, I'm here to support you, right? And I really think, like, all of us, including Ruha's work, right, with the Just Data Lab, is sort of an example of that, right? If you know that you're not really going to fit with the way that things are right now and you don't really want to, then you might as well just use whatever power you have to show by example what you want to see. And then people can have something to grab onto and say, wait, this is actually possible because look, I can see mechanism design for social good, or the Just Data Lab, or Black in AI, or whatever it is, right? And so maybe I can replicate that in my own institutions or in my own workplaces.
Great, thank you so much. That all of your stories are so personal, and you know, it just really grounds us in what we all experience in so many different ways. But just to hear details and specifics from people's lives is really so powerful. So Matt, you are, in the law, right? You are dealing with legislation and activists who don't necessarily, as you said, always have, that background in law. So you're doing a lot of translation work and also being very inclusive in terms of how you guys are even, imagining goals. You don't want to just sort of spearhead, right, as a privileged, powerful institution. So if you could just talk a little bit about your own position, within the ACLU and within law, and just really trying to make change and to create some ripples and movements and really pluck away at some of these really trenchant power structures from where you sit.
Yeah, I thought Ruha Rediet's points perfectly illustrate a dynamic that I see as someone with white skin in a profession that is, the legal profession is incredibly white and incredibly privileged and incredibly hierarchical. I can go on with incrediblies that are not flattering, on and on, because it's just the case that the legal profession it's freighted with many historical inequities. And this is something that we have to carry as lawyers into the room every time we have conversations with our allies and every time we're talking about what we're going to work on together, because I think there's a natural deference for people who are non-lawyers to defer to legal expertise in the room as somehow like the sort of dispositive or all-knowing sort of thing on the law. But the reality is that we have to realize as lawyers, and it's something that I work to try and realize throughout my actual actions, is that lawyers may understand how technical policies and laws read. They may understand what is necessary or what is sufficient to execute a particular policy or to satisfy the elements of a law. The lawyers do not understand how technology impacts people's lives. And we have to acknowledge that in the work we do and the legislation we write and the lawsuits we bring forward. Lawyers do not know, as well as impacted Black and brown communities, what it's like to be tracked by police at a protest. They don't know what it's like to be pulled over and to understand what it means to be pulled over as a Black person. Lawyers generally do not understand how it is the case that your social media post that you posted in a Facebook group might actually, about organizing the next protest, might actually become evidence in a case against you because there was an informant who infiltrated the group and decided to brand your Black Lives Matter chapter as a threat to public safety. So all I can say, I don't have much to add that is insightful in the way that Ruha and Rediet's comments were, but that lawyers, I think, have to just be more mindful of that privilege and that the weight that they can bring into a room, whether it's a conference room or whether it is being a speaker before a public body. And in our work, we try to create space where we recognize that actually in a lot of ways, non-lawyers are better at the lawyer job of understanding and explaining the law to the public than lawyers are. I have colleagues who work as communications experts who are incredibly powerful at taking the law and explaining why it matters to real people's lives and explaining how it impacts real people's lives. And so lawyers also need to acknowledge that they don't have the complete skill set for speaking in plain English in a way that connects to people's emotions and hearts on these issues. And those are just some of the shortcomings that lawyers have that I'll illustrate today. Great question.
I'll just add one footnote to that. And everything that Matt just said applies to technologists in terms of the expertise, the deference, and the same kind of humility and acknowledgement of the situated knowledge that communities have, that they're not simply people who need technical literacy, but they have often social and historical knowledge that the technologists need to learn from, in the same way that Matt is saying that lawyers need to learn from. And so I would encourage those who are listening from those STEM fields to take to heart the same kind of engagement that Matt articulated in their own work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. That idea of who and what kind of knowledge that we value oftentimes in society in terms of who has expertise, as if it's a proprietary thing, and then obviously it's cloistered in terms of institutions and who has access to those institutions. And so this question of value and how we value people and the knowledge is very important to just keep re-emphasizing. So thank you both. Thank all three of you. I want to thank all three of you on that point. What I'm seeing in the panel, Matt, you've worked on, issues around banning facial recognition, and there are so many problems with the uncertainty of facial recognition to recognize faces beyond, let's just say, middle-aged white faces, younger faces, Black and Asian faces, as the NIST report points out, as well as older faces, are harder to capture. And so these ideas of a ban or a moratorium or a sort of boycotting, on the one hand, is one way to engage and demand a more just technology. And, Rediet, in your work, you are really trying to, work with search data, work with different kinds of data to be more inclusive, right? And you're not really thinking of, I guess my question might be, are there ways in which all of you might think about banning or, pausing or, just asking a broader question in terms of the awareness piece? Do we need all of this? And in what sectors might just plugging away and going forward, be remiss, or just, thinking much more about technological fixes and how to fix the fix, right? I just wonder if in your conversations, in your work, in your own thinking, if there is this kind of, stepping back to really question, do we want everyone included? Is justice really about being included in a database that can then recognize us, right? That as the end game worries me a little bit with several technologies. Facial recognition is an obvious one, but I just wonder about, inclusion and consent and privacy, and how these factor into your work much more generally in terms of that question. Is this something that will really make our society more just, given that our society has a justice problem from get? So I'm just wondering how you all engage in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think when we think about what is power, I mean, real power requires the ability to say no to things. And so in earlier work in the context of healthcare and medicine, I've written about the idea of informed refusal as a corollary to informed consent, that if individuals or communities don't really have a genuine ability to refuse something, then there's likely coercion involved. Or a concept that I've been thinking a lot about lately is the notion of predatory inclusion. And so I think part of it is us really wrestling with what we think racism is or racial injustice is. And I think too often we tell one side of it, which is the notion that racism excludes people. And so for you, if your definition is that racism excludes people or communities, then your solution to racism is simply to include them or to represent them or to have them around the table. But crucially, racism is not simply inclusion. It never has been. And so one of the first things we have to do is understand that racism is productive. It has always relied on forms of inclusion, whether we talk about how diverse the plantation was, or we talk about the kinds of predatory loans that communities have. That's inclusion in the real estate market under a very extractive relationship. And so once you begin to wrestle with the fact that racism is productive, then you realize, okay, so when a company or a organization is reaching out to me or my community to include us, that's not a straightforward good. And one really quick example I'll offer is last year, almost exactly a year ago, The story hit the news that Google was rolling out its new Pixel 4 phone. And of course, the facial recognition, we know that it has a harder time detecting people with darker skin. And so in an effort to make an inclusive product, Google hired contract workers to approach people in predominantly Black areas, namely Atlanta, and the workers were directed to approach homeless people in particular, because they would be less likely to approach the media about what was happening. And specifically, the workers were told to have people play with the phone, take selfies, do little games, and not tell them that their images were being captured for training data that was meant to make the phone work better. And so for me, this is just a really simple illustration of how you can, your endpoint can be the buzzword inclusion and inclusive product, resting on a clearly coercive process in which information is withheld, in which literally the bodies of the most marginalized are become, food for the appetite of this rabid global, capitalism. And lastly, that these very communities are likely going to be the target of a better working facial recognition system in the end, right? Better able to be detected to say, you're sleeping in this park, or you're on this sidewalk. And so the very thing you're being enrolled to be included in is likely going to create a new kind of violent, targeting in the end. And so all that to say, inclusion is not a straightforward good. Racism is productive. And once we begin to do that, we can have a better conversation about what to do now.
Just as you're talking, Ruha, I'm remembering this Nas lyric, which is, inclusion is a hell of a drug.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Nas. Anyone else on that point?
Yeah, I would like to add, so I think one of the things that stands out to me is that a lot of times when we think about algorithms or data or machine learning or whatever technique you want to talk about, I get questions that are effectively like, is this good or is this bad? Just tell me. Are algorithms good or are they bad? Or is machine learning good or is it bad? Is this data set good or is it bad? And I just don't think of it that way, right? I want to know, what are you using it for? Right? Who has power over how the data is collected and how it's used and what it's used for, and can they consent out at some point, right? It's I think you really have to contextualize the technique that you're using or the data that you're using, and then try to answer questions around that. And so a lot of times what I do with my work is I kind of approach it in a very bottom-up manner, right? I'm interested in something and I go and I learn about it and I engage with people who've been thinking about it, or maybe it's something that affects me and my communities, and I just think about that for a while. And then I think about, okay, I think if we had these types of interventions or we made some progress in this direction, that would be good. And then I think about, is there a role that computing can play in making progress here? And sometimes the answer is no. And then I just proceed with, the other tools that I have at my disposal as a member of the society and as someone who has other skills, right? And I apply those. Other times I find that there's something that we can do here that would move things in the right direction. Yeah. And so I think when we think about data, when we think about data inequality more generally, we should think about different types of inequalities that can be there, right? So I think inclusion can be a type of inequality because maybe that data set is being used to surveil you. Exclusion can also be a kind of inequality, right? So for instance, one of the problems that I've worked on for some time is questions related to maternal mortality in the US. We know that Black women die at 3 to 4 times the rate as other people. And we know that that rate actually is much higher in some parts of the country. So in New York City, it's 12 times, right? And we know that this is a huge issue, and you can look at the, like the pile of public policy and public health work that's been done. And there's just no adequate explanation for what's going on, why this is happening. Right? We think it's, broadly about racism, but exactly how is it playing out? We don't know. And one of the things that I noticed in engaging with this problem is that it's really hard to make progress here because we don't actually have data sets that accurately capture the experiences of Black individuals who give birth, right? And so we're just sort of limited in our understanding of exactly what's going on here. So in that setting, actually, if we had more data on this, right, and data that was collected in a responsible manner, that would be really helpful, because then maybe it would tell us if we did this, if we we had doulas, if we had midwives, if we had this kind of intervention early on, if we had more Black doctors, whatever it is, right? It would tell us if you did these things, maybe it would move things in the right direction, right? So I think exclusion is also a form of inequality. And I want to get back to the point that was raised about data ownership, right? And sort of data access. Once the data is collected, who has access to it, right? Because a lot of times we know that, for instance, in the African continent, right, where we've been thinking about data practices, we know that actually people based outside of the continent have easier access to data set that was generated in the continent. Because what happens is that the data is collected and then it's sold by whoever on the continent to external organizations outside of the continent. They price the data by, you know, global standards, US standards, whatever it is. And then effectively communities within the continent are shut out of their own data, right? And so I don't really care what's in the data set. If people whose data is being collected have less access to it than people who are based outside, how is that fair? How is that just? How is that equitable, right? And so I think that's a different form of inequality. Who has ownership over the data? Who has easy access to the data? Who gets credit for the data, right? Because a lot of times you see these papers written by, you know, folks on, you know, using this and that to solve poverty and solve this and that in Africa. And then you look at the authors and it's like no one in Africa, right? And you're like, well, how'd you get access to the data? And why are the people who collected the data not acknowledged in your work? And I think that's incredibly important. So I think I just want to wrap up by saying that I think we should think about these things in a sort of bottom-up manner. Let's start with the problem, right? And then think about, you know, the data set within the context of that problem, because a data set can be good for one problem, but actually really harmful for another.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we see that across fields, right? Data is not, you know, it has multiple uses, but it's really about the intention, right, of how data is used and what questions we hope to ask. That these are not fixed, because obviously it just really depends on the context and the questions. So Rediet, you pointed out a lot of different levels at which fairness, you know, operates or doesn't operate, just in terms of access to the data, how the data is collected, how the data is used. And I think at all of those levels, right, we need to be thinking about, I think, what Ruha so eloquently phrased as informed refusal. and you know, and part of that is early conversations about what a checkup means, that you're actually getting data collected, right? So much of this is happening in ways and in interactions that aren't always explicit. And so the informed consent or informed conversation or whatever we want to call it, you know, just really needs more emphasis as well. So Matt, did you want to add anything to this bit?
I would just piggybacking on Ruha's amazing idea of informed refusal. That is in many ways that is an idea that motivates the work we've been doing to pass facial recognition bans. In American law, power fills vacuums, and what isn't prohibited is allowed for governments to do as a general matter. That involves deploying new dangerous surveillance systems. And so one of the driving forces behind passing bans is to flip the default, to make it so that we're not waiting for law enforcement to wash over a community with the new surveillance technology. We're flipping the switch to no, and we're saying that the control and the power should actually rest in the community via their elected leaders to decide if that thing should ever go forward. And so what my co-panelists are saying really rings in, I think what we do try just to ring in what they're saying, which is really shifting the ability to say no, or the default to the ability to say no, rather than the default being it goes and it happens, and then society and impacted people are left to clean up the harms, and which often cannot be undone.
Yeah, great. I want to come back to, and you know, I know that we're getting short on time, so I'm going to link a few things. A quote from Rediet early on, she said, we like to pretend like in tech, we like to pretend like things are better than they are, but things are actually really bad sometimes. You know, being in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area for the last 8-9 years or so, and really watching this expansion, right? In 2013, Facebook went public, and you know, Twitter expanded, and just being in the real estate market, just being in the culture between San Francisco, Palo Alto, and Oakland, now where I live, there really is this crazy making optimism sometimes, right? That this is revolutionary and it's all good. When you see in reality the, sort of just the exhaust on so many levels. People are exhausted, but there's this emissions exhaust from all of this tech, right? There's the data exhaust that's being collected, and then there's the sort of social, the arts, dwindling, people moving, the communities in terms of the vibrancy of a place like downtown Oakland really changing and shifting. And so there is this discourse of revolution, of precision, right? We see this language of precision policing, precision medicine, precision. And I just wonder, to end, I don't want to end on sort of a doomsday, sort of very negative note, but just how do you contend with those tensions, right? This hyper optimism, which just feels like sugar, right? There's just something very ersatz and very just not right about that. And then, like what you were saying, Rediet, and I think that all of us can see there are potential applications, there are potential interventions that can be had. And so I just wanted to hear you all end on, sort of where you see hope, what your vision entails, where you're bothered, the confluence of all three, etc.
Yeah, I love your characterization of the milieu that you're in, and it really reminds us that for all the talk of precision, for all the appeal to computation as more objective and neutral, so much of the culture of tech is suffused in speculation and storytelling and imagination in all its variety, so that speculation, both in terms of economic sort of speculation in startups, but so much storytelling about what the future holds. And one of the ways that I tend to think about the world building that tech is engaged in is that it creates this really captivating imagination and entices, it's enticing. It's not just a top-down thing, but it's something that elicits our own desires. But then ultimately that dream of tech utopianism really relies on many different kinds of nightmares, whether we talk about the labor involved in to keep the story of automation going, and the kinds of embodied labor and exploitation. Just in so many different ways, I think we have to always keep in mind this relationality between the fantasy of tech utopianism and the many kind of nightmares that it relies on. It's not that these are parallel universes. These are deeply relational, that that dream of this, this more efficient, usually bright white future in the aesthetics of the future relies on an underside. So that to me is not a reason to despair, because if subordinated people, oppressed people, subaltern, literally under the earth, have demonstrated, there are so many different ways to imagine differently that people and communities have had to do as a matter of survival. That is, subaltern is not just to be buried, but there's a lot happening underground in terms of really thinking about the worlds that we want to live in that are possible for us to thrive. And so I think part of what we have to do is have to really grow and to see counter imaginaries, other ways of thinking about what other futures do we want to invest in and to water and to shine a light on, rather than only focusing on the critique of the future we don't want. I think we have to invest energies, and that's happening all around us. And so that's one of the things that my work tries to do, is to remind us that there's so many different niches, groups, collectives, movements that are seeding alternatives. And so part of it is to build that capacity so that we can, we're not trapped in other people's imagination.
Beautiful, so beautifully said. Thank you, Ruha.
It is very hard to top that, but I'll just say, I think for myself, I'm a computer scientist. That is the set of techniques that I love. I've always loved, and that's what I'm going to keep trying to do. And so my hope actually is for my computational community. I have such high hopes for our community. I think that we have caused a lot of harm, and we continue to cause a lot of harm. I think we've tried to help and messed up, right? And I think we've tried to help and sometimes helped. And I think the reason why it's turned out this way is because we have centered our techniques. We have been like, you know, here's an algorithm that I really, really like, and I'm gonna try to make it do this thing as quickly or as accurately as whatever is possible. And we've really been so obsessed with our techniques and how to make them sharper in this way or in that way, and just forgotten about the applications. And so my hope is for my community to look different. My hope is for my community to teach differently, and to teach in a way that actually centers communities, and especially those that are underrepresented. And I think that's going to require broad curricular changes. I think it's going to require broad changes about how we include people in different spaces, how we admit people. It's going to require broad changes around how even little things like, how do we recommend people? Do we do the sort of lone genius thing that Ruha was mentioning earlier, where we say, look at this person, they are so amazing, they did this and that, rather than look at this person, they are able to foster a community that enables everyone to bring their best selves, right? Which one is better? One person who comes in with like whatever it is that they can do, or another person who actually empowers a bunch of other people. And so that's where my hope is. I think that I reject both. I reject both the sort of the techno-optimism, and I also reject the throw out the algorithm, it's not useful. I don't think that's an informed attitude either. And so I think if you're curious, there is one paper that we wrote that was many conversations and fights that we had when I was at Cornell, and then it ended up being a paper on roles for computing and social change. And I think it sort of captures this this space that I occupy, that's both sort of very informed about the many active harms that our tools have caused, but also the good that they can do, right? And how we can kind of think through those and reimagine what our community should look like.
Great. I believe we just put that paper, as well as other papers written by the panelists, in the chat for those attending. Thank you so much, Rediet. And Matt, let's hear from you.
Those were wonderful comments. I can't top either of those wonderful comments. I'll just say that I'm really excited to be doing be part of a process in a community that is reimagining and what the future can look like. After this sugar high that you've referred to, that the tech industry washed over the last 20 or 30 years in the Bay Area and America and the world, is that sugar high is really worn off. And I think we're at while the damage is incalculable in many ways and has harmed real people, I also am optimistic that the realization of those harms, or the recognition of those harms, is going to create a space where we can reimagine the future and play a role of telling an affirmative story and bringing allies together who can tell affirmative stories for how the world should look. That's something we think a lot about when we're working on facial recognition. Opposition is not just explaining why this is a bad thing, which there are plenty of ways to do that, but explaining why it is that the world we want on the other side of the ban is going to be a better one for all of us and our partners. So I just want to plus 1,000 to both of the comments that we just heard.
Great. I wanted to take a question or two from any of the attendees. That's perhaps not a technical question that is narrow, but something that maybe all of the panelists might speak to. And I don't see, we were trying to cull some of those as we were going on. But nonetheless, I guess what we'll do is just close at this point, just because we've gone over a little bit, and I don't see any questions that are really broadly framed for all the panelists. So thank you all so much. This has been such a enlightening and fun, and just beyond interdisciplinary discussion. And I wish you all the best, and I want to stay in touch with all of you and keep these conversations going, right? This is to be continued in spades, given where we're at this moment in our, this moment in time. So thank you all. And
thank you for moderating, Duana. Thank you for the center for hosting us. We really, any excuse to be in conversation with you all, I love it. So thank you.
Great. So with that, we will conclude the session. Thanks again.
Yeah.